We are recording.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Schaefer, Director of Program Support for the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project. Welcome to OBehave 2.0 webinar series. This is the second in a three-part behavior series focusing on the development of behavior intervention plans for your classroom, facilitated by Malara Tomeno and Edward Miguel, the founders of Portview Prep. Kristen Brooks and myself, directors of the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project, welcome you. Jeff Kramer, previously from the California Department of Education, reviewed AB 2657, the Behavior and Restraint and Seclusion Bill. If you would like to have more information on that bill, you can review any of our previous recordings. The first 20 to 30 minutes focus on that bill. We have a ton of content to cover today. So Malara and Edward will be focusing today on replacement behaviors. Next slide. Just a little bit of information on the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project. We work with about 45 districts across the state of California to improve educational outcomes and inclusion of students with disabilities in general education settings. If you would like to join us on social media, Facebook and Twitter, to be up to date on the goings on around California and any of the events that we host, you can find us at SIP Inclusion or go to our website at www.sipinclusion.org. Next slide. We've created an overview of the series of three behavior intervention plan development webinars. This is the second, as I said previously. On Thursday, April 30th, will be the final behavior intervention plan webinar named Modifying the BIP. You can find the registration link. We'll put that in the chat, and you can register for the third and final webinar. Next slide. We've created a Padlet. The Padlet web link is at the top of the slide. You can review any of the previous webinar recordings and materials that are available. 2 weeks ago, we did our first BIP webinar, number 4A. The recording is available, as well as the flyer and the materials utilized. If you go to the Padlet right now, you can download the reinforcement inventory that Eddie and Malara will be referencing in this webinar production. And just to let everybody know, the chat is open. We will be monitoring the chat with answering questions, with links. So if you have any questions, please enter there. Everyone is muted. And we hope you find today's webinar enlightening and useful. Next slide. And Malara and Eddie, that's your cue. Take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to part 2 of developing behavior intervention plans for your classroom. If you were not in part 1, I strongly suggest going to the Padlet and downloading or printing the blank behavior intervention plan that we have posted there, as we will be completing portions of that today for your students. So just in case you haven't, next slide. So who are we? We are, as Kevin stated, the founders of Portview Preparatory, which is a non-public school for students with pretty severe autism and severe challenging behaviors. We manage the challenging behaviors all without the use of restraint and seclusion, and that's why this training on the behavior intervention plans is so important with new legislation coming out like AB 2657 in reducing restraint and seclusion in your schools and in your classrooms. So that's really the focus of these trainings and the focus of how we write our behavior intervention plans. And our hope is to share that with you guys as well so that you can reduce restraint and seclusion and hopefully eliminate it. We also have a consulting branch, which is the prep group, where we go into schools or meet with families to try and keep students in a less restricted environment instead of having them have to go out to county programs or NPSs or residential. So that's what the prep group is as well. So that's who we are. Next slide. We got some feedback from previous webinars that they've felt like there wasn't enough time to answer questions, or they had like some lingering thoughts that they wanted to run past us. So at 3 o'clock, Eddie and I will stay on. If anybody does have any questions or specifics to your student, please stay and join us after, and we can chat with you more. Like I said in the chat, this is a very interactive session also today. So we're actually going to have 3 sessions where we're working on our behavior intervention plans, and you'll have time then to put in the chat specific questions about your student that we'll be monitoring during that writing time and answering as well. Next slide. Okay, so an overview and review of what we covered and what we're going to cover today. Next slide. So today we're just going to quickly review the components of the behavior intervention plan that we use at Portview, given that that was covered much more in depth in our first session. Then we're going to start talking about setting and environmental events and developing those for your behavior intervention plan, talking about schedules of reinforcement, and then really diving into replacement behavior goals and how we write those. We're going to do all of this through a case example together. But then also, and more importantly, you're going to be doing it with a student that you selected in part 1 or that you'll be selecting today.
When you're making that selection, it doesn't have to be a student that currently exhibits high rates of challenging behavior. It can just be a student that you want to see make improvements. That's part of the mindset shift, which is, you know, we're teaching you how to develop behavior intervention plans in order to prevent or reduce the likelihood of a behavior ever occurring, not necessarily after a behavior has occurred. And hopefully you'll find that this process is actually kind of fun and it makes you feel like a detective, and you'll start developing these as you get students or you come into contact with students prior to behaviors ever getting too severe.
Next slide. So just to review from part 1, for those of you that weren't with us, or for review for those of you who maybe we went through it too quickly, these are what we feel are really critical components of a behavior intervention plan. So they are function-based, meaning that it's not behavior specific, it's function specific, so what the behavior functions to serve. We always include operational topography, so it's measurable and it's extremely clear what the behavior looks like, and that's what we did in part 1 together. The onset and offset, so this is what indicates that the behavior has started, and then what indicates that the behavior has stopped, and really defining those 2 key elements so that your paraprofessionals or anyone else in your classroom taking data knows exactly when to consider a behavior as starting and finished. And we also worked on those last time. The next element of a behavior intervention plan is those setting and environmental events. So these are what causes the behavior to happen. What are the SDs or what stimuli in the environment are causing the individual to have the behavior? And what are those cues that our paraprofessionals can be looking for to either alter or modify, or to know that if one of those things is coming up, we have to prime our student and make sure that the supports are in place for our student. The next is a hypothesized function. So if you haven't confirmed the function, what are your hypothesized functions of why the behavior is occurring? Then also the functionally equivalent replacement behaviors. And I think this is probably one of the most important components of the behavior intervention plan. And we're going to really be diving deep into these today. So this is essentially, if we want the behavior to stop, what are we going to replace it with? And I'll talk about how we at Portview write our replacement behavior goals in 3 areas: functional communication training, tolerance training, and then regulation and coping. And we'll go through those. We'll do examples together, and we'll also write them for our students as well. The next component is the schedule of reinforcement, and we're going to be developing this for our students together today as well. So this is how often are they reinforced for the replacement behaviors that you're going to be writing, and when does that schedule thin? And don't worry if you don't understand that terminology, I'm going to go through all of it. Next is the modified setting events. We're also going to do this today. When we write the setting events, we're going to talk about then what needs to be modified for the behavior. And that's things like the student needs, differential seating. They need to be closer to the board. They need to be sitting on a wiggle ball. They need to have soundproofing headphones. What do we need to modify in the environment to help that student be successful and to reduce the probability that that student is going to have a behavior in the future? And we're going to go into this in much more detail. The next part of your behavior intervention plan needs to be your antecedent procedures. So what do you need to do before the behavior even happens? And we're going to be identifying, reviewing, and plugging these in on part 3 on April 30th. And then the consequence-based procedures are, okay, well, when our plan fails, then what do we do? So when the behavior does still happen, what do we do? And those are your consequence-based procedures. And we'll be talking about those and inputting those into our behavior intervention plans on April 30th as well. So that's a very quick review of the critical components of your plan. Next slide. All right, so reading and creating a behavior intervention plan. Next slide.
All right, so the purpose of the behavior plan, and we went over this a little bit last time too, the plan is individualized for each student and created based on the function of behavior. It is a consented plan structured for individual behavior success for the students. If you use SACE, that's one place you can find it. If you use other web IP, etc., there are templates on there as well. And I mean, by and large, you can make your own template. We're providing you with the components there in the previous slide of 2 slides ago, where if you have those components in there, you've essentially developed the bulk of a behavior intervention plan. And then if you combine that with our FBA training, you've got your FBA and your behavior intervention plan. Bottom line is that the plan is structured for success for the student, and it needs to be consistent. And the goal is to reduce or eliminate challenging behavior. So if the plan doesn't do those things, then it is not an effective plan. A big piece of all of this is it is designed for the students, but it needs to be understood by all that read it. And that's why one of the ethical foundations of behavior analysis is that we explain things in layman's terms. Some of the questions that came up outside of the webinar was that some of the explanations were not layman enough. If you need clarification on anything that we've said, I strongly encourage you to stick around at 3 and we can answer those questions or explain them differently. Next slide.
Okay, so if you haven't already, please choose your student who you're going to work with and write their name down. And if you didn't in part 1, write as quick of a definition as you can about that student. I'll give you guys like 2 minutes to do this, just because this was covered in part 1. Do 1 more minute. All right, I hope most of you have a student in mind and one of their challenging behaviors that you can utilize as we go through this. So next slide. So we're going to start talking now about setting and environmental events, and I'm going to go deeper into what those are, but I want to first start with our case example. So next slide. So as we're watching this video, try to think of things that you see in the environment that may be triggering the behavior. You can go ahead and start the video. Okay, so can anybody see anything in the video that they feel like could have been causing the behavior? And you can also advance to the next slide. You can put it in the chat. So a transition or a demand, yes. Staff touching students. The counting definitely is, so having known this student, that stimuli, and you could see that very clearly when he was looking over across the classroom to where the sound was coming from. Anything else? The other huge one in this is attention being withheld. So I don't know if you recognize that every time the staff would walk away, he'd start hitting himself and like looking like, are they going to come back? So that withholding of attention was definitely one in this case as well. Okay, so next slide. So for those of you that weren't here last time, let's just dig a little bit more into setting events and what they are. And then we're gonna write our own. We'll have 10 minutes to write our own for our students. And then because this isn't in person, we'll be available through the chat to like process with you. So like if you're like, I don't know, this is what's happening, we'll kind of go through it with you in the chat to try and help you identify what those setting events are in your classroom. But like I said, there are triggers to the challenging behavior. So it's the why, like why is this challenging behavior occurring? And like I said, last time we all met, you have to look at, yes, the environment, and the environment is so, so, so important, but are there any internal factors as well or changes in the student's life? So has there been a medication change? Are there health issues? Do you see it when the student is sick? I think another example I gave in a previous webinar was we are conducting an FBA for a student at another school, and every time he has to have a bowel movement, he'll be constipated for days and there's like no behavior. And then right before the bowel movement is gonna occur, he has a huge outburst. So that's a setting event for him. So you have to start looking at other factors besides what's in your immediate environment to really dig deep into what's going on. Next slide. We're gonna do modified setting events after. So next slide, and then we'll go back. Okay, so I want you guys now to take your blank behavior intervention plan and start writing what the setting events are for your student that you have selected. And like I said, we are in the chat to process this with you and help identify what yours are. And we have 10 minutes to do this. So we're gonna come back at 1:30, but we're here monitoring the chat the whole time. So have fun writing.
So for those of you that are not maybe paying as close attention to the chat, one of the suggestions that was brought up was transitions into the school building. it can be an aspect of that transition that may need modification. So if you're thinking of general concepts like transitions or sounds or non-preferred tasks, also try to dig a little deeper and think of the components of each thing, and see if you can narrow it down even more, and look at proposing that as part of your setting event.
Another example of a setting event is maybe some of those precursors. So we talked before about the student that we've done this training before, and the student that would run out of the classroom onto the busy highway, and upon examination, the student would put their head down. So I would indicate that in the section too. So every time before the student would bolt, they would put their head down. So I would put that as a setting event to the behavior, because it always came before the behavior. So things like that would go in this section as well.
And a lot of times too, another example would be access to communication, whether their verbal ability impedes them finding the words that they need to express, whether they don't have access to their communication device. Sometimes communication devices are only located at school. And so they spend an hour bus ride not being able to communicate, and their tolerance level is nothing at that point. So definitely communication is a very important feature for consideration in terms of setting events and a child's ability to regulate or access types of regulation.
We have about 6 minutes left, and then we're going to share with the group via the chat what you guys came up with for your setting events. So keep writing. And try and visualize the behavior in your head. Like, what's happening before this kid has their outburst? What's happening before they run out of the classroom? And get all of that stuff down on paper. Just realized it wasn't in the. Melanie, I just realized that my response only went to the panelists, so I'm responding to everybody now about your question.
Melanie actually brings up a really interesting situation we've experienced quite a bit. The absence of home supports in the morning that affect transitions into school. Even if the supports aren't there, it is still important for you as part of your FBA and your BIP to recommend the types of supports that are necessary for the student to be successful. So, for example, in Melanie's case, there's not supports there. What if there were supports there? What would they need to do to help the student effectively transition into the school setting or successfully transition into the school setting? And that will guide that recommendation for there to be supports. And that's where we reach out to our regional centers or wraparound programs and say, hey, you know, when we do these things, the student's more successful. Let's get some supports in there.
Okay, about 1 more minute. All right. So you guys have had 10 minutes to identify. Melanie has shared with us, and like Eddie said, a really common one, I think, is A, transitions just in general, and then B, those competing environments, the home being one of them. So what examples did other people come up with? And please share through the chat because we can process together and everyone can learn from each other's examples.
Fighting with your parent before school starts, yeah.
So is that student that fights with the parent and comes in upset, are they more like an ED, like emotionally disturbed student? Are they more autism spectrum, or what's their primary diagnosis? Because I think that would gauge speech and specific learning. So I think would they be capable of like the counseling service or that debriefing period upon arrival into the school?
We also have a math worksheet placed on the table, which, yes, non-preferred. How do we modify that assignment? How do we prime? Those are things that we'll consider once we establish that as a setting event. Lack of sleep as well, and having parents journal or communicate via communication log helps us monitor and measure that. We know how to, when there are days of less sleep, we can work towards helping the student regulate on those days.
Are there any others, like common ones that we see are aversive stimuli, like in the environment? So if another student is having a challenging behavior, in fact, we were just in a conversation with a parent this morning where now that the brothers are home together all the time, one has sound sensitivities and the other one has very loud stereotypy. And so that has become the setting event for the brothers' outbursts, is the other brother's stereotypy. So other students potentially making noise. In the chat, I see student transitioning from group story time to directed work table rotations. Yeah, and Christina, I think that lends itself to what I was talking to Melanie about too. Is it only that specific transition, or do you need to look at all? My guess is that group story time is preferred and directed work table rotations is non-preferred. So is it all preferred to non-preferred transitions? But yes, this is absolutely a good setting event. And then when we get into our modified setting events, what can we be doing to avoid that behavior from happening and making it easier for the student to transition? So for example, priming the group that it's coming, giving the student a transitional object. So that student that has a hard time transitioning to the directed work tables, they would be in charge of maybe bringing some of the materials to the table So the focus transitions away from where they're going and their job that they have. They're so important. They have this job that they have to take the paper and put it on the teacher's table. Different things like that could potentially help. A quick maintenance task in between the two. So getting them to do a really high frequency behavior that they do often, that's really easy for them. Like, for example, maybe just going and getting a drink of water. And then they go to the directed work table, something to break it up. And we'll talk about that when we get into the modified setting events. I don't actually have it. They do have counseling. So if they do, for the student who gets in a fight with the parent and the respondent said they do have counseling, I would collaborate with the counselor, which I'm sure you're probably doing, and potentially on those mornings, if there was a way for the parent to indicate to you so that that's the first thing the student does. I know schedules don't always permit that. And then Christine, I say it's several transition, it's all preferred to non-preferred. Yeah, so the same feedback on the modified setting events. And in your setting events section, I would specifically say that. So you could say transitions from preferred to non-preferred. And then under that, you can say example from group story time to directed work tables. If you can and you know all of them, I would list all of them. So your paras and anyone working in your class, or if you had a sub, everyone was really aware of what would be likely to set off a behavior. Debbie, that's a great suggestion, helping the teacher get papers ready for classwork for Christina's student. All right, are there any others?
We have attempting to communicate with peers. I'm understanding that to be a setting event. I'm assuming that the student attempts to communicate with peers and actually needs to focus on something else, and that might trigger the behavior. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that can definitely be a setting event.
So is everyone good on their setting events? Does everyone have them down and they're clear?
Just make sure that when you're identifying these setting events, you're identifying them with the intent to modify them, okay? If it's not something that you can imagine modifying, then you might need to double down and dissect it a little bit more. Down the line, if you get to the modified setting events and you don't have anything to modify, then we're essentially not going to get where we need to go.
And yes, all of these, Melanie commented, it just requires observation time to identify them. And yes, so we're getting examples down right now, but when you go back to your classrooms, absolutely that time to process and observe what's going on is going to be so relevant and important. All right, so next slide. Actually, I'm sorry, can you go 2 back? Sorry, Dawn, thank you. Okay, so once we've identified the precursors for behaviors, so those setting events or their environmental events, we need to figure out what things we need to change. So this is going to be things that modify the environment in an effort to decrease the likelihood of the target or challenging behaviors occurring in the future. Now, they still might occur, but we're going to do everything that we can to be proactive and help for them not to occur. So while a computer sitting on the teacher's desk may not be a setting event, it may need to be involved in a modified setting event. So if the student gets up to transition to work time and they get really angry that they're going to a non-preferred work time and they slam the computer off the desk, that's something in the environment that needs to be modified. That computer needs to be moved or anchored to the table. Setting events can also be directly tied, modified setting events can also be directly tied to the setting event. So if the student, like I said, has a sound sensitivity, a modified setting event would be those soundproofing headphones. They don't completely eliminate the sound, but they just reduce it enough. So it's any environmental modifications, supports, or programming that you have to do in your classroom to reduce the likelihood that this behavior is going to happen again in the future. So in our example of our student, we had things like setting clear and firm contingencies, breaks from demands contingent on task completion. So they didn't have to go from one demand or one task to the next task. They would have a break in between. Differentially reinforcing staying on task and following demands. visual schedules in place throughout the day, token economy in place throughout the day, and then a visual timer. So those are all changes to the environment that we made, or additions to the environment that we made to help the student be successful. So now what I want you guys to do, you can go to the next slide. I want you guys to write one back. Write and share your modified setting events, and we'll take another 10 minutes to get them down on paper. And then I want to have that same conversation that we did through the chat on how we're going to be modifying our classrooms or our setting events.
If you could write the setting event and then the modification so that we understand it as you provide your input. And we've got around 50 participants, so you know, we're ready for a bunch of responses. So please do contribute in the chat.
I saw that Kristen said something.
Don, Kristen had a suggestion. Do you want to go back to the definitions of the modified setting events for people who will be the previous slide? Yeah.
One forward.
One forward. Thanks, Kristen, for your suggestion.
Miranda, for your student who you've been tracking for months, have you been taking ABC data? And Amy, yes, they're going through now. So is it, and there's no patterns in the ABC data, Miranda? So if there's no patterns, Miranda, it could be automatically maintained, meaning that just engaging in the behavior in and of itself is what's causing the behavior to occur. These are really difficult behaviors to target. Research shows that the only thing that's effective for younger kids is teaching play skills. And then for older students, I've generalized the data because what's equivalent to our play, like working out or leisure activities of some sort. And so that's what I do for automatically maintained behaviors. We're going to talk about replacement behaviors for those. The other thing that you might want to consider doing, we did our FBA presentation before this, potentially watching that and maybe getting more guidance on how to run an FBA, or ask your district's BCBAs or behavior analysts to do an FBA with a functional analysis to more systematically look at what that function might be. That's what I would do. Melanie, for the lack of sleep, your modified events could be quiet time or space, cozy cube, quiet activities. Yes, I would also look at alerting activities as well. So talking to your occupational therapist about, because the ones that you said are really, really good, and they're going to need that quiet time for sure if they didn't sleep. But then once that quiet time is over, we're going to need to know how to get them alerted so they can return to instruction and they're not sleeping all day at school. So finding out what those alerting activities for that student might be also from your occupational therapist. We have about 7 more minutes on this one. Amy, for your student, she shared that her student is a high functioning individual with autism in high school. He won't complete any work because he's particular about the type of work he completes, and it's all busy work in his words. So a couple things. One, do you have any technology that you can embed, and would he still view that as busy work, or is it more like paper pencil? Also, what does he like to do? And I would embed that in. So if you look at the literature on compliance training, if you start with preferred, but place the demand to do the preferred, and then reinforce when they do it. So for example, say he likes coloring or jigsaw puzzles, I don't know. You would prescribe that as work. So, okay, let's do the jigsaw puzzle. That's what we're doing for work today. And then when he does it, whoa, you did such a good job doing your work today. That was amazing. And then you slowly work up to the work you need him to get done. And then, like I said, incorporating any technology or any preferreds into his work would be really helpful. The move was from classroom, remote from designated areas in the classroom.
So Annika, did the student engage in elopement prior to the transition to the gen ed setting? Did the student demonstrate elopement prior to his transition, his or her transition to the general ed setting? Okay, so was there an existing plan in place in the SDC setting? All right, and then I think the next obvious question was the plan implemented to sustain that decrease in the gen ed setting? And this is again a case where the studying events might change because of the change in environment. And when we're looking at changes in environments, we want to make sure that we're updating our intervention plans to reflect the environment that the student's in, or maybe we're not modifying the plan, we're identifying the potential setting events in the plan that they're transitioning to prior to the actual transition occurring. One thing that we've seen, especially when we transition students to lesser restrictive environments, whether they're leaving our school or they're leaving to, going from Ahmad Sabir to Mahmad, is that the environment is not used to incorporating some of the supports that we prescribe. So always the first step is training the team in the transitioning environment and how to implement those supports, plan for those setting events, modify setting events before the student arrives. It's got to become part of the team's repertoire before it can become part of intervention.
And then Annika, I just sent you an additional note also that if the behavior intervention plan was working and then he moved to another environment with those supports that you said in place, it's really important to do fidelity sessions to ensure that the behavior intervention plan is being implemented as prescribed. Because if it's not, then of course you're going to see an increase in the behavior. And then also just looking at the number of students in both environments, simply the increased frequency of students, noise, stimuli could also be affecting if they were going from, I think you said SDC class to Gen Ed. But yeah, it sounds like you guys have a good handle, and if you are working to adjust the plan for the new environment, my hope would be that yes, you would start to see a decrease again. Of course, then we had the COVID pandemic, and who knows what's going to happen when you get back.
I'm sure we're all gearing up for that. Okay, Katie, setting event is going under his desk, which is a precursor for eloping from the room. Modified setting event prompts student when he moves under the desk to request an item from a choice board for a specified amount of time. I mean, all you have to do is add the time and I can implement that, and I don't even know the student. I like how you laid that out very simply.
I would also try and catch him before he gets under the desk, because a student underneath the desk is a lot harder to prompt and engage than if you could get him when he's like just pushing his chair out, and then you can start, boom, right there before he actually gets under. Some of our students are super quick, so it may just be getting on the ground and working with him. But yeah, I agree. I like how you laid that out. All right, are there any others?
Let's see, how do you address differences of opinion? Differences of opinion, I responded to the wrong person on the chat, but this is something that we've had a lot of experience with, and it stemmed back from our early days when we were, you know, the crazy folks not using restraint, seclusion, and we were using things like sensory diets and things like that. It's evidence and data. So you provide an intervention, you take data on it, the obvious decrease or increase in behavior is going to address those differences of opinions. Now, if you're specifically discussing, you know, the development in general of the plan and differences of opinion there, that's where you got to rely on that FDA, and where it spells out, you know, what either the proven function is or the hypothesized function is. And that guides what type of intervention needs to be implemented. Now, the only other thing I want to add to this is that a lot of times differences of opinion arise from a BCBA going into a classroom and telling a teacher to modify their classroom, their entire classroom and their structure for this one student. And the goal of a behavior intervention plan is to make a student successful in the environment that they're in. Now, that doesn't always happen, because maybe a more or less restrictive environment would be better for that student, but it will help to prove that back. So when opinions do come to play, it is really important to redirect those that have strong opinions back to the evidence and then go from there.
And if your BCBAs aren't doing that for you, we're both behavior analysts, so we can say this. Ask them to, like, they need to come into your environment in your classroom and modify it to help you as the teacher. It shouldn't be the other around, or behavior intervention plans should not be developed in a vacuum. They need to be contextually specific to the environment that they're being written in.
One of the things that we were training, I think, I don't know, 100 or so teachers in person, and when we told the teachers that a BIP was a tool to make their lives easier, they were just, you know, so surprised that we were explaining it that way. And that really is what it is. That work needs to mean something for you, the teacher, the paraprofessionals in the classroom. And because you've done such a good job spelling it out, making it, writing things in layman's terms, relying on evidence, you know, it should be easy to follow. And, you know, the direct effect of that plan is a better learning environment for everyone.
All right, next slide. And thank you for the participation, you guys. That was really great.
Yeah.
Next slide. Okay, so once you know what you need to change in the environment, and then once you have your replacement behaviors, but I wanted to spend the bulk of the time on the replacement behaviors, so I put this one first. You need to decide what you're going to reinforce, how often you're going to reinforce, and then how you're going to thin that to the natural environment. And thinning the schedule of reinforcement essentially means reinforcing less often. So let's talk about that. And then we want to identify our reinforcement schedules for our students in the behavior intervention plans that we're writing right now. So next slide. So there's different types of reinforcers. There's primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are what we're born being reinforced by. So they have biological importance, things like food, liquids, sleep, shelter. They're unlearned, they're unconditioned. Like I said, we're just born to be reinforced by them and need them. Oftentimes in school settings, we're using secondary reinforcers, things like tokens, verbal praise, preferred activities to reinforce a non-preferred activity. And these things oftentimes need to be conditioned. We oftentimes forget to pair them with the primary reinforcers, so they take on reinforcing qualities. So I'm going to do a very blunt example to kind of put it in those layman's terms. So if I want to use a token economy, the token may not be reinforcing for the kid. They could care less. I don't know what this is. It looks like the same coins I'm identifying in my money goal. So you have to pair it with a primary reinforcer so that it becomes reinforcing, and then you remove the primary reinforcer. So I would take, for a kid that maybe likes chocolate, those mini M&Ms are great. You don't have to use too many of them. They're small enough that by the time you have 10 of them, it's really like only one M&M. So you take your token and the mini M&M and you give the token to the student. That's how you're pairing the primary and the secondary, so that the secondary eventually becomes reinforcing by itself. So don't forget to condition your secondary reinforcers to ensure that they are reinforcers. And it's only a reinforcer after a history of reinforcement is established. And we're going to go into how you establish that something is a reinforcer in a little bit and pretty briefly, just because that's a whole nother training. But you guys are more than welcome to email us for any resources on that as well. Next slide. And that leads me to this slide. So how do you identify if a reinforcer is a reinforcer? And this is done through preference assessments. So it's important to identify what's a reinforcer empirically, because staff, parents, teachers, even the students themselves are oftentimes very poor reporters of what's reinforcing to them. And this is just based on research that has been done in the area of reinforcement. And if something isn't reinforcing, it's not going to work, right? It's not going to increase the behavior we want to increase or decrease the behavior we want to decrease. So you really need to choose and identify your reinforcers carefully. There's two strategies that you should be using in tandem to identify your reinforcers. So one, I always start with a reinforcer assessment. That's actually my second bullet. And I did put ours on the Padlet. So this is where I ask the parents, previous teachers, if the student is capable of filling it out, the student themselves, to rate and just indicate what their reinforcers are. And there's a huge list that they can check off. That's going to lead to what items I'm going to have available and what classifications of items I'm going to have available for my more formal preference assessment. Now, like I said, preference assessments are a science in and of themselves. So I'm just going to cover it pretty briefly. And again, if you want more resources or my PowerPoint on this, I can share that. But there's single stimulus presentation preference assessments where you're only giving one item at a time. There's paired stimulus preference assessments, and that's, I would say, the most common. So that's things like, do you want your chapstick or the phone? And then they pick what they want, and then you indicate which one of the two that you selected, and then you rank them at the end to see which one came out that they chose the most often. There's multiple stimulus without replacement and actually with replacement also. So that's where you have about 5 to 10 items. You have them all out on the table and you say, go ahead, pick one. And the first one they pick is ranked a 1. And then you either put it back or don't put it back, depending on the kind that you do. And then they pick again what they want next. And the idea is that whatever they're picking first, second, third, that's the order in which it's reinforcing to them. and you're going to come up with your top reinforcers from that. The last type is engagement based. So again, you put out a bunch of different items that you gathered from your reinforcer assessment, and you see which items they play with the longest or engage with the longest. So for like an older student, like I would make sure that some of their favorite food items were there, probably a can of soda or juice, their iPad, whatever it may be, but you're going to get all of those ideas from your reinforcer assessment that your parents, previous teachers, anyone in the individual's life, including the individual themselves, had completed for you. And once again, that reinforcer assessment that we use at Portview is on the Padlet. Next slide. So that's how you identify your reinforcers. So once you've identified your reinforcer, and you're going to list those in the schedule of reinforcement section on the BIP, you want to list what the reinforcers are for that student, so that anyone that picks up this document doesn't have to go back and do those darn preference assessments again. If they stop working, then you have to do them again because our preferences change over time. For schedules of reinforcement, there's continuous or intermittent. So basically, continuous is that you're going to be providing reinforcement every time the behavior occurs. So when do I use this and what do I indicate in my behavior intervention plans? I use it when it's teaching a new skill, or the behavior I need to see occurs so infrequently, I have to reinforce it every time it's going to happen to make sure it's maintained. Limitations with it is that there's the chance of satiation, right? So if every time my student asks me for a cookie, I give them a cookie, eventually they're going to get sick of cookies, and probably sooner than later. And it's also not as effective at keeping behavior once it's acquired, because the student knows if I don't ask nicely this time, I'm going to get it next time I ask nicely. So they can start to predict what these schedules are. So again, continuous I use for low frequency behaviors or brand new behaviors or difficult behaviors that I'm trying to teach. I then move to more intermittent schedules. So this is when we're going to start reinforcing some, but not all occurrences of the behavior. So in our BIPs at Portview, we start to move to an intermittent schedule once the skill's already in the student's behavioral repertoire. And this is really great because it's going to decrease the likelihood that they get satiated on it because they're not going to get it as often. And it's also more resistant to extinction of the behavior or decreases in the behavior because they're not going to be able to predict when they're going to get the reinforcement. So they're going to keep doing the behavior in hopes of getting it eventually. Next slide. So when you're looking at intermittent schedules, you also then have to determine if you're going to do ratio or interval or fixed or variable. So with ratio, you're looking at the number of responses required before they get the reinforcer. So it's just like trials or episodes or demonstrations of the behavior, whereas interval is a specified time. So about every 30 minutes, I'm going to give the student a cookie. And you're, again, going to want to indicate this in your reinforcement schedule section, and we'll go over an example. The next thing you have to decide, and the last thing, once you know your you've identified your reinforcers, you've decided I'm going to start with continuous, then I'm going to fade to intermittent. When I fade to intermittent, I'm going to be doing ratio. Then you have to decide if it's a fixed number of responses or duration or variable. So fixed would be every third time they do this skill, I'm going to give them a cookie. And variable is approximately every 3 times I'm going to give them a cookie. So sometimes it might be 2, sometimes it might be 4, sometimes it might be 1. It's just a variable schedule that's going to average out to about 3. And the way that you would indicate these, if you were doing a fixed ratio 3, it would be FR3. If you're doing a variable interval 2, that means variable interval about every 2 minutes, it would be VI2. So that's what you're going to see in our example. Next slide.
Just to add to, from an oversight perspective, you know, we're using the example of chocolate or cookies or whatever. If you are implementing or designing a plan, and then the intent is for the classroom team to implement it, give them more than one reinforcer, okay? Because here's what happens. The reinforcer stops working. All of a sudden, after about a week, you get notified that the student behaviors are increasing. And you say, well, have you been reinforcing? And they say, well, last week, they stopped wanting this cookie, okay? And what we need to do is have enough reinforcers in there so that if the cookie doesn't work, then it's something else. And they can make that change in the moment so that we can sustain the levels of behavior, all right? So if you are having trouble during the reinforcement inventory, or if you only have discovered one, I would encourage you that as the child is exposed to more things, that you have your staff and yourself constantly be analyzing what is reinforcing for the child. Oftentimes, I find out reinforcers just with the child going through their day, okay? If I walk in the library and they pick up a particular book out of an array of books, I'm keeping that book in my back pocket for the next break period, okay? If I go to the student store that we have and they order the same thing every time, maybe I need to use an aspect of that as part of reinforcement. I talk to the parents. What do they always want? What helps you calm them down? I get ideas there. But give your team more than one reinforcer.
Okay. This next slide is basically when you're training. So you have identified what the reinforcers are, and you've identified the schedule at which it's going to be delivered, and then you've identified when you're going to thin or reduce from continuous reinforcement or every response to then intermittent. And then you've identified what that intermittent looks like. There's more considerations that you need to train your paras on, and that's making the reinforcement effective. And I like to use this little acronym when I'm training. You can have it within the BIP, or you could just have it up in your classrooms, but it's basically DISC is the acronym. And it's deprivation, satiation, immediacy, size, and it must be contingent. So deprivation, satiation, how long has it been since they've had it? You have to create establishing operations. So if my student, for whatever reason, their reinforcer is still, some type of food item, I'm not gonna work on their most difficult task right after lunch when they've already eaten and they're gonna care less about the granola bar I'm chopping up for them to earn. You have to create that establishing operation and be careful in your programming and your planning of when you're going to target the skills that you need to replace the challenging behaviors with. The next point is immediacy. So the reinforcement must come within 3 seconds of the behavior, or behaviors happening all day long. So if you want your student to ask for a break, they asked for a break nicely, they went on a break, and then when they get back, you're like, hey, that was awesome reinforcing the break, but on the way back, they kicked the trash can over. You could be reinforcing accidentally kicking the trash can over. So a lot of things happen in between behaviors. So you want to make sure that you reinforce about 3 minutes after the behavior you want to reinforce occurs.
3 seconds.
3 seconds, sorry, thank you. The size of the reinforcer also, so the amount must be worth the effort. And if you were in other previous trainings with us, we gave examples of all of these too, so you can watch the recordings. But you don't want to give one of those mini M&Ms I was talking about for a student who you've been working with for months on trying to go to the bathroom independently, and they finally go and their diaper's dry, and you give them this mini M&M. I'd be like, what? So you want to make the size worth the effort of the behavior. And then finally, contingent. So it's only available when the desired behavior occurs. And this is where you really have to get that collaboration with the parents, or really utilize that reinforcement survey. If you know the kid loves cheesy crackers and parents are going to give him Goldfish at home no matter what, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do about it, either use something else or use Cheez-Its. Use another variation of it, something they're not getting at home, so that the delivery of the reinforcement is contingent with the behavior, meaning it's paired with the behavior, it's occurring with the behavior. Otherwise, they're going to know I can just go home and get it anyway.
Something to always have in the back of your mind is, especially with students that have been engaging in challenging behaviors over time, is that they consider engaging in those challenging behaviors low effort, high reward. And so what you're doing by developing a behavior intervention plan is you're making it low effort to access appropriate forms of reinforcement, i.e. little M&Ms or whatever, and you're making it high effort to access any inappropriate forms of reinforcement, okay? So you have to flip the script a little bit, and all that analysis that you've done in the FBA and all that ABC data, that's really where this comes to a head. And it's developing these forms of reinforcement so that the student is ready and willing to engage in appropriate behavior to access reinforcement from you that is appropriate.
All right, next slide. Okay, so if we think about that video that we showed you, let's think about him and what the schedule of reinforcement needs to look like for him. So for him, I would start by reinforcing continuously for every time he walked to his chair instead of dropping. And then I would reinforce with attention, because it really seemed that he was acting out to get the attention of the teacher. So I would do my best to withhold attention for the dropping and the hitting his face. You have to block it, but just don't give positive attention. And then when he got to his desk nicely, I would give him a ton of like, oh my gosh, you did amazing, that was incredible. A ton of really positive attention. I would do that every single time it happened. Once it was in his behavioral repertoire, meaning he's doing it consistently about 3, school days in a row, I'm then gonna fade it to about every 2 or 3 responses. So like maybe I'd start at every other. So an intermittent ratio 2, or intermittent ratio 2 is about every 2 times. He's gonna walk to his desk, he's gonna sit down. I just go on with my instruction. It's already in his repertoire. He already knows he did what he was supposed to. Then the next time it happens, he's gonna get that same, oh my gosh, you did so good. And you're gonna wanna note all of that in your schedule of reinforcement section. So here's just another example of what we have in the sample bit. So social praise will always be paired and continuously delivered. So always delivered, contingent upon replacement behaviors. Begin reinforcing replacement behaviors using a continuous schedule paired with social praise. Once the replacement behaviors are in Derek's behavior repertoire, thin a paired reinforcer to a variable schedule. So that's just another example. So next slide. All right, so next slide. I just did the case example. All right, so now it's time for you guys to decide what your reinforcement schedules are going to look like and identify what you think are some of the possible reinforcers for your students and get that noted down in that section. We'll take about 10 minutes, so we'll go till about 2:20 and then we'll share out with the team.
Anybody have any questions while you're working on this? Or if you want to propose something you've written, you're more than welcome to do that in the chat. I would highly recommend pairing social praise wherever possible, because that is a perfect segue to fading out that tangible reinforcer or that edible reinforcer. And you know, by and large, social praise is something that is pretty evident in or across environments. And when students can feel reinforced entirely based on social praise, that is definitely lesser restrictive than always having to carry, you know, M&Ms or bonbons in your back pocket. They're a quiet crowd this time around.
Uh-oh.
They're probably thinking heavy.
Okay, I hope so. If you guys have any questions like about the different schedules or what you should do, like please put it in the chat and we can respond.
I told them that.
Oh, okay. All right, we'll take a couple more minutes then.
Oh yeah, where's DJ Kevin? I thought you had a hit list lined up for us,
Yeah,
Kevin.
he said he was going to play Funky Cold Medina. I don't know what happened.
Not this time.
Okay. Yeah, so that's great. So modified work could be one type of reinforcer, and then that I would think would be on a continuous schedule. So that would be like a FR1, so a fixed ratio 1. So every time he was given a math worksheet, it was modified to his level. And then the number of math problems completed equals listening to the book on tape. So I would start with a fixed number there. So like every 3 math problems, so like fixed ratio 3 leads to the reinforcer, and then I would fade or thin to like a variable ratio like 5, depending on how difficult that would look. So I'll put in the chat right here what that would look like in my behavior intervention plan. So I would say something like begin with a fixed
When you're thinking about time-based reinforcers too, you want to collect some baseline data in order to you know, conform with Melora's DISC description, meaning that, you know, the amount of time will be reinforcing enough. So Melora gave you an example of how she would write it. out. And of course, it probably even helps to define FR3, etc., for your viewers of the viewers of your behavior plan, either in the IEP meeting or on the document itself, because you might know what FR and BR are, but maybe the parents don't, etc.
So instead of putting the answer in the chat, Melanie asked a really great question. She said, when would you make that adjustment from like a fixed schedule to an intermittent schedule? And I use that when it's in the students' behavioral repertoire, meaning they've been successful with it for about 3 school days. And I would probably do across different math modalities too. So like if they're working on multiplication and division, or if they're working on fractions and area and circumference, I don't know. I would make sure that it was they were consistently doing it across different types of math problems for about 3 days. But you decide this for your school or your classroom. You determine what in behavioral repertoire means. For me, it's about 3 days demonstrating the skill at mastery, and then I fade. So you should be able to fade pretty quickly. But that was a really good question. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is the best part. This is the fun part, and we can go to the next slide. This is where we actually get to start teaching. So in previous trainings, you've heard us say that it's insufficient and unrealistic to only target behavior reduction and to only write behavior reduction goals. However, we see this a lot. I just got in the chat, can you respond to Amy? But okay, Eddie's gonna do that. But I continue to see behavior intervention plans that only say student will reduce aggressive behavior to 1 instance per day. And that's awesome that we're tracking that, right? We need that data. We need to know that it's decreasing. But what are we replacing it with? Instead of hitting to get whatever need hitting is serving met, what are we going to teach them to do instead? And that is where your functionally equivalent replacement behavior goals come into play. And these are the most important part of your behavior intervention plan. And this is where you should spend the most time. So for every behavior or function, you need a minimum of 3 replacement behavior goals. And like I said earlier in today's talk, those should center around functional communication training, tolerance training, or coping and regulation. And I'm going to go through now by function examples of functionally equivalent behavior goals before you guys write yours for your behaviors. So next slide. Okay, so for a behavior that is serving to get out of doing something, so for example, I forgot who it was, the one we were just talking about with the math, that every time you put a math worksheet down, they would escape. I would do essentially 3 goals. 1 in the area of functional communication training, 1 tolerating doing their math, and then 3, how do they cope and how do they adjust to having to do something they don't want to do. So the first goal would be something like, by June 6th, when presented with an aversive task, in our example, math, Johnny will request a break on 80% of opportunities over 5 consecutive school days and across 3 tasks. And this is where those reinforcement schedules come into place that you guys just developed. This is what indicates how often, when Johnny asks for a break, how often you're going to actually give it to him. So at first, when instead of just getting up and running out of the classroom, the first time Johnny asks me for a break, you better believe I'm giving it to him, and right away. And I'm going to do it every single time until that elopement starts decreasing, because he knows if I just ask, I'll get it. And then I'm going to start fading to about every other time he asks. So that's where the tolerance training comes in and the coping, because eventually, once the skill that we want is in his repertoire, he's going to have to learn to tolerate that which he's trying to avoid. So by June 6, 2020, Johnny will tolerate non-preferred tasks as evidenced by task engagement for a duration of 12 minutes on 80% of opportunities over 5 consecutive school days and across 3 tasks. You can also write this to mirror our example that we were talking about. So our ultimate goal, I think we said, was 6. So Johnny will tolerate non-preferred tasks as evidenced by task engagement for, as evidenced by 6 math problems completed. on 80% of opportunities. And then finally, regulation. You need to teach them, if they're doing something they don't want to do and they're having to tolerate something they don't want to do, we know one thing with this population is that it's difficult for them to self-regulate. And so we need to teach them regulatory and coping strategies. So something like, by June 6th, 2020, Johnny will engage with 3 novel sensory fidgets while completing non-preferred tasks on 80% of opportunities over 5 consecutive school days and across 3 tasks. So that's 3 examples of replacement behaviors for 1 escape maintained behavior. So for every behavior you're trying to decrease, you need at least 3 goals. And that's in addition to if you wrote a behavior reduction goal. Next slide. So what would we do for attention maintained behaviors? So by June 6th, 2020, when attention is withheld, Johnny will say, "Excuse me," paired with the individual's name on 80% of opportunities over 5 consecutive school days and across 3 individuals and 3 settings. So this is a goal I for sure would have done with that student in the video, where you could see he was clearly hitting himself to get the teachers to come over to him. So instead of hitting himself, I'm going to teach him to say, "Excuse me, Miss Isis." Now he's going to have to tolerate, because Miss Isis can't always be with him. She needs to be teaching other students. She's going to have, bathroom breaks, lunch breaks. She can't always be with him. So he needs to tolerate also. So Johnny will tolerate attention being withheld and work independently for 30 minutes on 80% of opportunities over 5 consecutive school days and across settings. Now, 30 minutes for that student in the video who was trying to get attention by hitting himself is way too long. So your first benchmark might be 1 minute or 30 seconds, depending on the student. And then they're going to need, again, a coping calming strategy to help them deal with not having the attention that they want. So Johnny will complete all steps of the behavior relaxation curriculum and engage in taking deep breaths upon level 1 escalation on 80% of opportunities over 5 consecutive school days and across 3 settings. So what does this look like in real life? Johnny says, "Excuse me, Miss Isis, please come here." And we're on the intermittent schedule now, so she's not reinforcing it yet. She's to say, "Okay, I need 1 minute." And then Johnny's gonna say, "Oh gosh, I have to tolerate, I'm at 1 minute." And he's gonna start being prompted by his aide or whoever else to start taking deep breaths. So it all kind of goes together with their asking, the tolerating, and then how they calm and get through the tolerance. Next slide. Okay. The third function of behavior that we did talk about in the previous trainings is access. So oftentimes our students engage in the target behavior to gain access to what it is they want. So let's talk about the 3 goals here. So the functional communication training goal can look something like this. And these are just examples, you guys. When we write our own, after we go through all the examples, I want us to get super creative and come up with really, really awesome goals that we can all share with one another so that we go back with a ton of ideas for different goals that we could be doing. For access, for functional communication, I would teach Johnny to use a 3 to 5 word phrase to request preferred items on 80% of opportunities over 5 consecutive school days and across 3 individuals, 3 settings, and a minimum of 5 requests. For the tolerance training, it's going to be something like, Johnny will tolerate delayed access to preferred items as evidenced by continuation of current task or selection of an alternative item on 80% of opportunities over 5 consecutive school days and across 3 preferred items. So he's going to have to tolerate having a delay between when he asks for the item and when he actually gets the item. And then he's going to have a regulation tool to help cope with that. So Johnny will engage in 3 novel relaxation or leisure skill activities and engage in those activities when denied access to preferred items or activities it occurs on 80% of opportunities over 5 consecutive school days and across 3 settings. Next slide. Okay, so like I said earlier, the automatic function is the hardest to get rid of. And again, as I stated, research demonstrates that really the only effective way to get rid of it is with play skills with younger students. And there's a little bit of literature on like exercise for older students, and leisure skills. So if I have something to fill my time and occupy my time, I'm not going to need to rock or flap or stim in any way. So the examples that I used was for a student that had really scripted phrases. So he would just continuously and repeatedly say the scripted phrases instead of using any functional communication at all. So his goal was that Johnny will demonstrate 2 non-scripted phrases during a 5-minute probe, and we did probes throughout the day, on 80% of opportunities over 5 consecutive school days and across 3 individuals and 3 settings. And then to tap into the research base and the research knowledge that we had, I taught him a play skill. So Johnny will demonstrate functional play with 5 new play items on 80% of opportunities. As we know, play leads to language acquisition. So I believe that's why I wrote the goal in this way, to be play skills, to try and get more language that he could then use in a really functional way. So those are all of the examples of functional behavior goals. These are actually also on the Padlet from our last time together if you guys want examples as you're writing yours now. So next slide. So like we talked about, it's insufficient and unrealistic to only teach how to reduce. You need to replace. You need a minimum of 3 replacement goals for every behavior. And those areas should be in functional communication training, tolerance training, and coping and regulation. So in addition to the examples that I just gave you, some that are in this sample bit are requesting for needs, so a break, requesting for help, task engagement would replace off-task behavior, peer interaction play skills might replace stereotypy, and then denied and delayed access could replace having an outburst due to denied access.
Amy, we were just dialoguing about this via the chat. This is a good guideline for you right there in that right box for your student who is escaping assignments.
So right now I want to take about 15 minutes. We're going to do a little bit longer because you guys have 3 goals to write, and I want to make sure you indicate in the goal what the skill is in each area. So functional communication, tolerance training, and then the coping and regulation. And then what is mastery criteria? So how do you define it in your district? Our behavior team uses % opportunity, but our teachers use like 4 out of 5 trials. So however you guys measure. And then your generalization criteria would be across 3 settings, across 3 instructors, however you want that to be. And please, please use my examples as driving forces for your goals. And then after the 15 minutes, we're going to share. So we'll start to share at about 2:45. And when you share, if you can say what your behavior is, and then what your goal for functional communication is, what your goal for tolerance is, and what your goal for regulation is. And I think that'll help us have a really rich conversation about that.
So Carrie asked for us to share that. I did add it to the the chat box publicly. Hopefully that helps. And that's sort of the sequence that Melora and I go through. We were thinking the whole process through. And, you know, in the case, well, Amy initially said, you know, there's no reinforcement dollars, you know, doesn't want to do any work, but the reinforcer is escape. And then teaching appropriate forms of escape. That's going to inspire language. And so right up here, we have play skills as an example for escape here on this exact slide. So again, all of the goals that you can come up with will allow for reinforcement, and you can use that. You can use that as guidance for fostering appropriate forms of escape that are more conducive to the environment. Hi, Jeannie. Jeannie, how do we determine what forces inferred for students' diagnosis ODD? It's just going to depend on the behaviors that they're exhibiting, not necessarily their diagnosis. So if you want to elaborate more on the behaviors that you're seeing, really at the end of the day, you start forgetting about diagnosis once you really dig into the behaviors, and they just become specifically behavioral conversations. So Jeannie, feel free to share whatever challenging behaviors you're seeing.
One thing I do with some of our kids that have high levels of noncompliance or ODD tendencies is I use the control in my favor. So I give them opportunities for control. So for instance, I'll place like 6, before they even get into class, like 6 sticky notes on their desk of things that need to get done that entire day. And they come in and the first thing I say to them, what don't you want to do? I know you're going to tell me you don't want to do it. So I want you to take off 3 right now that you don't want to do. Awesome. Thank you. All right. Which one do you want to start with? I don't care. I don't care what you start with. Just go ahead, pick. And using that leverage and trying to use their oppositional nature to, in your favor, basically, helps a lot. All right. We have about 10 more minutes to write your replacement behavior goals. Remember, for every behavior, you need 3.
If you finish a goal and you want to cut and paste it into the chat box so we can look at it and give you feedback, please do. Cynthia, this was addressed at the beginning of the webinar. If you download the file, even though it tells you that it's too large, it will still download. Kevin Schaefer and Kristen Brooks promise it will work.
And if it doesn't, for some strange reason, our contact is at the end. And you can always contact us for anything.
You're welcome, Cynthia. Like I said, anybody that has any goals they want to throw in that chat box for us to look at, or if you're halfway through a goal but you can't quite figure it out, go ahead and pop it in the chat box. We'll help you out. Amy, we were talking before, definitely want to write a goal for denied access to escape. Definitely a task engagement goal, definitely a requesting break goal. Requesting help would be nice because you might be able to find out if your student would prefer someone working with them on the tasks, and then you could fade that support. Putting parents in school line, eloping from school to get what he wants. Cursing at peers, post accessory appropriate material, Google Classroom, blaming others. Yeah. So you got your hands full. It's the ODD.
Oh,
Okay.
it's not coming up in here.
So for goals, think about what the classroom sort of requirements are for socially appropriate behavior. Okay. And then also think about the skills that this student is lacking. Obviously, you know, appropriate interactions or interacting with staff and peers appropriately would be one. Protesting appropriately would be one. Following a schedule might be one. Following school rules might be one. So Jean, what is the biggest skill deficit in that student that has oppositional defiant disorder? And we can target that specific skill in the form of a goal. Okay, Lucia, that's a good. So your goal is student will use functional communication strategies to request a break or attention from a staff member and tolerate a delay. What I would do, because your data is not going to be as informative as it could be if you keep it combined, is I would do one functional communication goal for a break, one for attention, and then one for tolerating delay. So you have them all there, but you want to be able to track the tolerance of delays separately from the actual use of functional communication, because it could be very likely the student uses the functional communication but doesn't tolerate the delay, and you won't know which one is which. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Melanie also brought a good point up that I just want to share with the group. One of her replacement behavior goals for doing math was to ask for the book on tape, but the book on tape was his reinforcer. So you don't want to teach him to the target behavior is getting him to finish his math. So we don't want him to have to ask to then get his reinforcer. So we're having a really great and rich conversation now about having him either ask for help, asking for assistance, asking for a break. This student is resistant, so I'm still working with Melanie, but I just wanted to share that you don't want your student to ask for what it is they're earning.
So Jeannie, let's dial in. Your response to me was ability to accept responsibility for actions or his ability to recover from mistakes. So then the goal would be to follow a certain rule or a certain sequence of rules in the classroom. Certainly there's classroom rules or classroom guidelines. And you would spell those out. You can actually target them separately. So if one of them is appropriate voice volume, and then one of them is staying in your seat, you could target those as two separate goals. The issue with accepting responsibility is that is a private event. We can't accurately, he could say he's accepting responsibility, or we could perceive that he's accepting responsibility. But it's really a private event that we can't effectively track based on what we see. So I would focus it more on the actual rule following and a demonstration of the skill that is required to follow the rule. And then in terms of recovery time after making mistakes, you can definitely address that. So for example, if the mistake is ripping up work, or let's just use ripping up work. Ripping up work, then you can target the amount of time that it takes for the student to recover and get back on task. So you could say following a demonstration of a target behavior or the target behavior of ripping up work, the student will get back on task in 5 minutes or less across 3 individuals, 3 settings, and 3 non-preferred tasks, or something like that. And Lucia, yeah, I just saw yours, definitely separated out. You're gonna get the best data that way. Jeannie, also tolerating frustrating or tolerating non-preferred situations or activities, definitely a great goal to write. So you have a tolerance goal you can throw out.
What was it for? Sorry,
It's for the ODD student. Basically, she said frustration tolerance is the biggest. So, I mean, we got to teach regulation, but we also got to teach tolerance.
Yeah. So you could do something like tolerating, completion of demands, like as evidenced by demand or direction completion within 60 seconds of the directive being delivered. Even just tolerating adult instruction. Some of the ODD kids, like you just say, okay, go get your backpack. No, I'm not going to go get my backpack. So like even like not them actually engaging in the behavior, but you say, okay, go get your backpack. And then the ODD kid just doesn't say anything. So just tolerates instructions being delivered to the class. You could start as simple as that. Amy, I love your goal number 2. So one of her replacement behavior goals is to request a break when they don't want to complete the assignment, but then she got really creative, and this is a really awesome idea. And this is a good idea for your ODD kiddo too. Maybe this is the same kid. Okay, we'll request an alternative assignment when he doesn't want to complete the assignment given. I think that's an awesome place to start with your students. If they don't want to do the assignment given, then request an alternative. We do that a lot with denied access. So if we're teaching denied access to something, then they can request an alternative.
And then number 4, Amy, that's going to be strategy is part of reinforcement, not necessarily a goal. But it's a good strategy to use, okay? So you could have a checklist. Let's say it's four assignments, or no, you said 1. So you could basically have a visual where the student is given 2 assignments, and if the student picked one, the other one goes away. You can even, if you really want to be literal, you can have the student shred it, which is reinforcing. So yeah, that's a really good strategy to use. Right, so we have did we miss something in terms of the isolation situation Jeannie's referring to?
I don't know. I'm not getting all the chats for some reason. So
you have to refresh it. Close it and open it. Yeah, parents struggle to work with him and maintain schedules and reinforcements. Yeah. I'm not sure how all y'all are feeling, especially being in the digital world. It's interesting, being now more of the support to the parents end. We don't have the students for 6 hours a day. So we're really having to work with the parents either via parent training or assisting them in making modifications and implementing the existing behavior plan. At this point, I think in a lot of ways we're doing what we can, right? And the biggest focus is how can we implement a plan that we know that works, while really the priority, with really the priority being the student's mental health and the family's mental health. You know, things may be implemented slower, they may be implemented slightly differently, especially since it's not in the school setting, but we're operating with the focus of, you know, the well-being emotionally of the families and the student. And Jeannie, if you want to talk more about the ODD student after this, we certainly can. And that goes for everybody. As you're brainstorming, you're getting real creative, you may want someone to bounce these ideas off of. Always email us. We love this part of our jobs. This is our passion. So we would love to be able to contribute to you as much as we can.
All right, so I hope everybody got, oh, we have one more chat. Unless I'm just getting these late, but okay. All right, so Eddie will respond to those. If you have more goals to share and you weren't able to on the chat, again, you can email those to us too, like Eddie was saying. And we will move on now because we have about 10 minutes left. So next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry, we didn't get there. Okay, so just a few important things to remember with your behavior intervention plans. We've now gotten through most of the plan. Next time we meet, it's going to be really intervention and strategy based on what we're actually doing. But you want to know the student you are working with. This is so important. I think it's almost impossible to write a behavior intervention plan if you don't really know the student and you don't know sometimes the really fine nuanced behaviors that they're demonstrating before they'll engage in the larger behavior. So really get to know your student before you finalize your behavior intervention plan. Consistent implementation. I think we've said it a couple times today that if something's going wrong and your behaviors are increasing or it doesn't appear that your behavior intervention plan is working, you first want to see if it's being implemented the way that you wrote it and the way that you intended for it to be implemented. Our paraprofessionals are amazing and they do such incredible work, but oftentimes they don't have the same knowledge or training or background that we have. And so they might be missing something or implementing something incorrectly. So you need to have consistent implementation if it's going to be effective. We do this at Portview by doing fidelity checks once a month with all of our behavior intervention plans. So we sit across the room. Whoever we're in there for does not know we're in there to observe them. And we take implementation fidelity. So are they implementing the behavior plan as it was written? And they have to get a score of 80% or more. If it's less than that, they go back through training. So you just want to continuously assess and determine if it's being implemented as prescribed. You also want to train to the behavior intervention plan. So you can't just develop this intervention plan and then give it to your parent and be like, hey, implement this, adios. You really want to train on the BIP and train to the BIP. So model those strategies for your paras or anybody else that comes into your class. Show them exactly what you mean. Show them what your reinforcement schedule looks like. Show them where to get the reinforcers that they might need. Show them how to implement the replacement behavior goals. You really want to train to the behavior intervention plan. And then again, just continuously assess through your data what the plan is doing. You want to look at trends in data. Is it going down? Is it going up? Are there spikes certain days? And then assess, is my BIP effective? Is it accurate? Is it where it needs to be? We tweak behavior intervention plans all the time. You have to. So you just have to continuously assess if it's where you need it to be. Next slide. All right, so next steps for this series. Our next webinar is webinar 3. It's April 30th from 1 to 3 p.m. And we're going to be developing the final components of our BIPs together. If you did not finish your replacement behavior goals today, and your reinforcement schedule, I encourage you, that's your homework, to get that done so that next time we meet, we're gonna go through all different types of interventions that you can use, all different types of antecedent strategies, all different types of consequence strategies, and then we're gonna be putting those and plugging those into our behavior intervention plans as a group together so that by the end of webinar 3, you should have a completed behavior intervention plan to take back to your IEP team. Next slide. So this is where I said all of our contact information was on. So both of our email addresses are there. Please feel free to email us at any time or contact us. All of our information is also on our website at www.portviewpreparatory.com. So feel free to reach out there as well. And I thank you guys so much for your time. And like we said in the beginning, we'll stick around for any questions and answers. And otherwise, I hope you guys all have great days.
Thank you so much. So I am going to stop the recording now, and that will enable us to have conversations regarding any questions everyone has. Let me go ahead and do that.
Debbie, I
Stop
think a couple
recording.
of the questions on the chat are